Hey fearsome friends, and happy Halloween. I'd like to introduce the lovely CurtainS to my channel. She'll be reading a couple of stories for you tonight. And if you like what you hear, please go over to her channel and subscribe. It'll be in today's video subscription. So without further ado, turn down the lights, close the curtains, get some treats, then sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm. Because it's time to let your nightmares in. The dusk air was clogged with the scent of deep-fried food and clouded with the exclamations of hundreds of happy carnival goers as they sped through the rides with reckless abandon. It was the perfect evening, the joyous atmosphere filling the hearts and minds of everyone there with enough fun to last until their next adventure. I couldn't help but smile my brightest, widest grin. It was the season of carnivals, fairs, and outdoor festivals. The sweet smell of cotton candy washed over the land like a flash flood. The bright emerald of my eyes swept over the masses, spying large overstuffed animals bobbing through the crowd as children and adults alike totted their prizes through the fairgrounds. Everyone here tonight was a child at heart, including myself. Spying one of my favourite carnival treats, the funhouse, I giddily trotted over towards the old converted trailer in search of those infamous mirrors and cheap pranks. My friends had all gone in search of their favourite greasy fair delicacies, leaving me to my own devices. While I disliked going on most of the rides by my lonesome, I could more than handle the various mysteries inside the funhouse. After all, they were mostly geared to scare children. Most of them I had seen a million times, and at most provided me a chuckle or two. Once in a while something would jump out and startle me, but even then the prank was met with laughter. It was a fun house after all. I dug a few tickets from my pocket, taking inventory as I read the sign outside the old trailer. A young Hispanic man stood by the door, his smile only broken by a sip from his fresh ice-cold lemonade that he held in his right hand. As people entered, he would smile and nod, placing their tickets in his pocket. It was 5 tickets to enter. I had exactly 7. What a fine way to end my magical night at the fair. Passing the little light blue squares of paper off to the vendor, I merrily stepped up the stairs and into the dark interior of the large refurbished trailer. I had to blink a few times to adjust my eyes to the light. And pausing just for a moment, I pulled the length of my long red hair back over my shoulders and secured it with the purple hair tie from my left wrist. I was ready to have some fun, all by my lonesome. As I began down the tiny dark corridor, I could hear the echoes of the people who entered before me chuckling and squealing. I heard a couple up ahead, the woman giggling like a schoolgirl after her boyfriend, or male counterpart I should say, instead of making assumptions, let out a frightened cry. I quietly uttered a chuckle. Men usually seem to be the biggest chickens when it comes to these types of thrills. As I rounded the first dark corner, I was met with my first scare. An old prop of a hanging man flew out from the way, its limbs flailing about limply from the sudden jolt that had forced it from its place in the wall. I jumped, and my body flooded with an anxious tingling that seemed to dissipate out through my fingers and toes. I chuckled, pushing the dummy aside as I headed further into the funhouse. However, there was something odd. As my fingers had pushed against the prop, it had felt slightly warm and gooey. Great effects. Perhaps they'd actually put some effort into things this year. After another couple of feet, a ghastly glowing sheet came flying across the ceiling, accompanied by the familiar ghostly sounds Halloween had made famous. My green sights followed the sheet until it disappeared into a back wall, and without a second thought, I made my way further down the hall. Before long, I came to another corridor, my face almost meeting the black wall rather abruptly, if not for my toes hitting the painted cardboard. I blinked, squinted for a moment to gather my bearings again. It was easy to get lost in places like this, the black interior and lack of lighting leaving you disorientated and easier to spook. Before I had time to recover from my encounter with the wall, there was a horrifying shriek, followed by another cheap prop dislodging from the wall. I let out a squeal of surprise, falling back onto the floor as the dummy swung back and forth in front of me. It had several flashing green LED lights scattered around in odd places. I chuckled as I plucked myself back up off the floor, gave my butt a rub or two, my cheeks a little sore from the tumble. But it was nothing big, especially not compared to the thrills I was getting this time around. I started off again, the dummy having the same warm, gooey texture as the last. This time, however, my fingers came away wet. I frowned a bit as I wiped them off on my jeans. It was probably glue from those little dollar store LED lights. Perhaps the vendor could offer me some wet wipes afterwards. It would only be right, since it was their sloppiness that had caused it. There were several more props that dislodged from the dark walls, their little trapdoors squeaking as they popped open to spit out some thrills. Various pained cries, shrieks, and Halloween sound effects echoed through the halls. I couldn't hear any more people in the trailer. They must have all made it out already. But I was having a blast, my voice bouncing through the darkness with chuckles and squeals. I hadn't thought twice about the grotesque creativity used in the props, most of the dummies appearing rather lifelike in the dark. To me, they were simply an improvement to the same old funhouse spiel. It was nice to see and feel some effort being put into this carnival classic. After about 5 minutes, I came to a door, my hands finding the knob before I even realized what was in front of me. I attempted to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. Frowning, I furrowed my brow in frustration, removing my attention from the door, and I felt my way around the hallway, running my fingers along the black walls. There didn't seem to be another way through, though. Maybe it was just jammed. I leaned my body into the door, my hands furled as tightly as they could around the little handle, but then I noticed something strange when I pressed up against the door. There was a low mechanical hum coming from behind it. I paused, pressing my ear to the black entryway as I listened intently for any other sounds. Perhaps it was the generator outside that powered the entire funhouse. So shrugging it off, I lofted a little sigh of disappointment as I realized the door was not going to budge. I'd taken a wrong turn, obviously. Prepared to turn around and shuffle my way back to find the correct path, I slipped in something wet on the floor. Immediately, my stomach churned as my mind raced to assumptions. Ugh, someone had probably thrown up in here, either from fear or intoxication, and I just stepped in it. Disgust rushed through me, quickly dispelling the happy vibe that had followed me around all evening. What a great way to end the night. Now focusing more on my surroundings, I began to notice a smell. It didn't reek of vomit, but rather it was a bitter, metallic smell. Oil from the generator? No, it was a little different. More bittersweet. I scrunched my nose before heading back down the corridor. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. I had to be close to the end by now. I had a sudden desire to go find my friends and head back home for the night. My fun had been ruined by someone else's bad luck. At least I wasn't the only one who had wandered down the wrong tunnel. Dragging my fingers along the walls, I searched for another passage. It only took a moment or two before my fingers slid around a corner to my right. I don't know how I managed to miss it before, but I hurriedly turned the corner, and my face smacked right into another prop as I did so. I shrieked with the sudden shock, my body instinctively falling back away from whatever it was I had just run into. As I glanced upwards towards the source of the thrill, several LED lights flickered on and off behind it, one of those cheap Halloween sound effects blaring in the background. What I saw in those few short-lived green flashes horrified me. This time I got a good look at the dummy, almost every last inch of its frame covered in what looked like blood. From the chest down into the stomach cavity was torn open, fresh sausage-looking guts poured out onto the floor. It hung suspended by its neck from the ceiling, and as I sat there on the floor, another bright green flash erupted behind it. It was then that the true terror struck me, terrified eyes rolled down towards me, peering down directly into my own. That was no dummy. Completely encompassed by the sudden onset of fear, my body went into overdrive as my limbs began to flail beneath me in an attempt to get up. I began to slip on blood that had pooled on the floor, and my heart beat feverishly against the walls of my chest, my breathing flying out of control as I began to drown in my own panic. All those dummies, those props, they were real. I began to whimper as it all began to sink in. Digging my heels down into the floor the best I could, I pushed myself back, crab walking back down the corridor in search of an exit. Losing track of time, I crawled back frantically through the dark hallway for what seemed like forever, until I felt it was safe to turn around. I wanted out of that freakish house of horrors immediately. That was no fun house. Rolling onto all fours, I became horribly aware of the racket I was making. How long had I been whimpering? Had someone heard me? Paralyzing fear threatened to break down the door to my subconscious as I crawled on all fours back the way I had come. I needed to get out of here immediately. Whoever was killing people might still be in there, and I didn't want to meet them. At long last I saw a brightening of the black heavy-duty cardboard walls of the funhouse. I gasped a sigh of relief, hot tears beginning to pour down my face as I hurried towards the exit. Sunlight became more apparent as I crawled, its weak last rays fighting for its life against the twilight. There was shuffling behind me now in the corridor, and I heard a low scraping sound. I whimpered loudly, my voice jagged with pure horror. I was almost out of this place. At last I reached the doorway from which I had entered, throwing my hands out and curling my fingers over the door jamb to thrust myself forward and on down to the stairs. As my body rolled out onto the grass, a loud cry of frustration echoed from inside the trailer. I didn't waste any time, rolling onto my stomach and pushing myself up onto my feet. Again my emerald eyes rolled along the crowd, their terrified faces gawking at me as I rose to my full height. I didn't wait. I didn't stop. Breaking out into tears, I pushed through the crowd, leaving bloody handprints on t-shirts and bare shoulders. I wanted to get out of there right now. When I finally found my friends, they'd all gathered around me in an effort to comfort my trembling frame. By then I was uncontrollably crying, my salty tears leaving streaks in the bright red blood from the funhouse. Security had already been called, and it took them very little time to find me. They had stormed the funhouse, quickly discovering the grisly remains of 11 people. The culprit had yet to be found, but they were scouring the grounds as they questioned me. I only half listened. The crowd of hundreds of people and their oversized stuffed animals suddenly terrified me. One of them, any one of them, could have been the culprit.
The pumpkins sang. The flickering lampposts cast the streets of Terraton in a dull glow, but with the illumination of the bonfire within them, the residents could do without it. Vampires, princesses, and fairies flitted about, baskets swinging from their hands. Superheroes chatted idly with creepy clowns, holding balloons, and skeletons warmed their bones by the satisfying heat. All were dancing to the song of the night, smoke curling up towards the full moon like greedy claws to a pearl. Pirates and demons worked in tandem to keep the fire roaring. Bats and black cats mingled on the side, while jack-o'-lanterns smiled on an barely contained excitement. Little werewolves eagerly galloped through the fields, squealing and devouring candies from their bursting sacks. In the hollow of Terraton, all was jubilant. The town celebrated in harmony. On the verge of the festivities, a young witch felt a tug on her cloak. She peered under the wide brim of her hat, turning her attention to a small ghost at her side. "Do you know where my mommy is?" it asked in a small, scared voice. Immediately, the witch took pity on the poor thing. It was covered in white, draped all the way to the ground with two tear-filled eyes that met hers. "I haven't, sweetheart," she cooed, her long black nails clenching her broomstick for balance as she stooped down to meet its gaze more evenly. "But I'd be happy to come look for her with you. What's your name, little one? Where did you last see your mommy?" "By the Jensen's house. I'm Liam." The witch paused. She didn't recognize any of those names. "Sorry, dear. I don't know them," she said, her voice calm and kind. "But come, let's search together." The specter nodded, and the witch straightened up. She didn't offer it her hand, as the little ghost seemingly had none. But then, suddenly, from underneath the veil of white, a long, skinny pale arm emerged and stretched towards her. The witch screamed, and everything stopped. The music, now interrupted, screeched to a halt. Heads turned in all directions, trying to find the source of the commotion. The bats squeaked and flapped their wings, and the cat's fur bristled in agitation. The ghost began to cry, and the sheet slipped from his head, fluttering like a useless tissue to the ground below. Almost in unison, Territum gasped. The werewolf children howled in alarm. Zombies' jaws dropped to the floor. Jack-o'-lanterns, chiseled grins shifted into little O's of surprise. All eyes were turned upon the sobbing child and the witch, who'd recoiled backward in shock. After a few seconds of utter silence, the witch finally composed herself. She dropped her broomstick to the ground and knelt beside the child, taking him into her arms. "Oh, I'm so sorry, darling. We just don't get many visitors like you here," she murmured, stroking his hair as he whimpered and shook. "Everything's perfectly all right. You're just turned around, that's all." She withdrew from his little body again, using her black cape to dry his blotchy red eyes. "Would you like to join our party until your mother comes to fetch you, Liam?" The child stared at the crowd, hesitating. The residents waited, with bated breath. When he gave a little nod, the group cheered. The werewolf children, eager to introduce themselves to a new friend, rushed forward to show him their games. The witch smiled as she watched his sad eyes brighten, his sheet forgotten as he was dragged into the fun. The party continued itself, and the bonfire burst back to life. And the pumpkins resumed their song. I want to give a special and honorable thank you to Miss Fearsome. Stay spooky out there.
Considering how much crap people give this movie, it honestly isn't that bad, Mark said while taking another sip of his beer. His wife, Claire, took another fistful of popcorn from her bowl. Just you wait. This is one of my favourite parts coming up. In the next scene, a boy wearing a pumpkin mask watched a flashing jack-o'-lantern on a television while a silly theme played in the background. Just as the mask began to rot and the kid fell to the ground, the doorbell rang. She grunted with disappointment and set the bowl of popcorn down on the coffee table. Right when we were getting to one of the best scenes, she grumbled with a hint of disappointment. Claire stood up from their couch and walked towards the front door, and whilst doing so, she grabbed a bowl of candy from their kitchen counter, along with her witch's hat. She placed the cheap cone on her head and made sure it was lopsided as she walked down the foyer. She could hear her husband's laughter bellowing as the sound of snakes and bugs squirming blared from the sound system, and as soon as she opened her front door, she was greeted with the delightful, high-pitched screams of small children. "Trick or treat!" they all yelled in unison at an ear-piercing pitch. "My, oh my, aren't you a scary little bunch?" Susan exclaimed as she extended the bowl in front of them. She allowed each child to take 2 pieces, and most of them immediately went for the good stuff, like Snickers and Reese's, just as she expected. None of them went for the Almond Joys, though, that had come in the variety bag. None of them had gone for the Almond Joys that had come in the variety bag, but she didn't really mind. They were her favourite anyway, so it meant more for her at the end of the night. "Stay safe, kids, and please be careful. This is a busy street, so watch out for cars." "Yes, ma'am," the group retorted whilst turning and running down the cobblestone path that snaked through her yard. One child, covered in zombie makeup, turned his head as he ran and yelled, "Thank you," which made Claire smile as she waved goodbye to the excited children. As she watched them take off towards the next house, she caught sight of her neighbour walking across the street. The two exchanged a friendly wave, and the woman and her daughter glanced up and down the street before running across it and up to Claire's front door. "Happy Halloween, Margaret," Claire said whilst holding out the candy bowl for her daughter. "You know, I've been looking all up and down the street for you. I'm guessing Mark went out with Tommy tonight." Margaret's daughter Elizabeth shuffled through the candy in the bowl and attempted to find one that would satisfy her cravings. Tommy actually went out with some friends from school. He was begging us all month to do it, and I was a little skeptical, but Mark was the one that pointed out that we need to let him off the leash a little bit now, so we came to a compromise that he couldn't go past Jefferson Street. Elizabeth squealed with delight as she finally found a Twix bar among all the pieces of candy, and she placed it in her bag and went back to scavenging through the bowl for another one. We also put a tracker app on his phone just to make sure he does as he's told. He's never really been a problem with this sort of thing, but I just wanted to be safe. They both looked down as Elizabeth made it known to the world that she had found 2 more Twix bars. "We need to get going. If we see Tommy anywhere he's not supposed to be, I'll give you a call." The 2 women hugged, and Margaret took her daughter by the hand. As they walked down the driveway and onto the sidewalk, Claire looked on with a smile. The 2 of them passed in front of a house and further down the street, and just as Claire was stepping back inside, she caught sight of something in her neighbour's yard. It was a child standing near the edge of the grass. Claire guessed he was about 10 years old from his size, and his small frame was covered in a dark pair of blue overalls that were easily 2 sizes too big. His face was hidden by a Michael Myers mask that was meant to be worn by an adult, causing it to appear almost comically large on the boy's head, and he had an orange plastic bag filled with a small amount of candy hung by his side from a small fist. She assumed it was the Johnson's kid, considering he was standing in their yard. "Did you want some candy, Robert?" Claire asked. The boy stood completely silent and motionless, and simply continued to stare at her with the hollow, black eye holes of the mask. Claire had never really known Robert to be a talkative boy, so this hardly surprised her, so she shrugged and shut the door and placed the bowl of candy back on the kitchen counter. Then she plopped down into the cushions of the couch. Just as she'd found the perfect comfortable position, Mark nudged her. "Would you mind grabbing me another beer?" She glared at him with an exhausted look. "You have no self-reliance, do you?" And just like many other times in the past, Mark flashed her a pitiful look. "Please?" he asked in a mocking child's voice. Claire grabbed the empty bottle from his hand and stood up from the couch. "God, you're insufferable," she said with a laugh. Claire walked into the kitchen and threw open the door to the refrigerator. As she grabbed one bottle, she figured that she might as well get one for herself. And as she placed them on the counter and opened a drawer to retrieve the bottle opener, something caught her attention. Just outside the kitchen window, she saw a shadow fly across the grass in the soft glow of their security light. She leaned closer to the glass that was frosted around the edges from the chill of the night air, and all she could see as she scanned the yard was a few dead leaves tumbled across the grass, which is what she deduced the movement must have been. Then the doorbell rang again. Her attention suddenly diverted to the front door. She left the bottles on the counter, grabbing the bowl of candy once more. As she flung open the door, she was not greeted with the familiar cheers of small children, like every other time that night. Instead, her front doorstep was empty. She glanced at her driveway to find no one in sight, until she looked over to the near edge of her lawn. The boy in the Michael Myers mask was standing next to the hedge that bordered Claire's yard. He stood completely still in the green glow of the Halloween lights that emitted from the front landscaping. And at this point, Claire knew this was not the neighbor's kid. Now, although Robert rarely spoke, she knew that he was not one to pull pranks like this. She attempted to see any details of his face through the holes in the mask, but to no avail. "Look, I don't know who you are, but either take some candy or get out of here." And she held out the bowl in his direction. The boy tilted his head to one side as the Halloween lights changed to a shade of purple. Then he pivoted on his heels and walked down her lawn towards the street. He vanished around the hedge and out of her sight. "Little weirdo," Claire muttered to herself whilst opening an Almond Joy and popping it into her mouth. As she set the candy bowl back down on the kitchen counter, Mark called to her from his perch in the living room. "Who are you yelling at?" "Just some kid who was standing in the yard. I saw him across the street in the Johnsons' yard a few minutes ago." "Well, did you offer him any candy?" "Yeah," Claire responded as she popped the caps off their beers. "But all he did was stare at me and walk off." "Good thing I'm here to protect you, honey." She rolled her eyes as she walked back to the living room. "My ass," Claire said, shoving the beer bottle into his hand. She tousled his hair and sat down on the couch with the popcorn bowl resting back in her lap. Then she picked up a handful and happily shoved it into her mouth. Suddenly, a scratching sound was heard, so she turned her head and found their dog standing at the back door, waiting to be let in. "Oh, come on," giving up her seat once again. Claire dragged her feet to the back door and slid it open. The black lab pranced inside with delight and vanished into the kitchen to search for scraps, leaving a few leaves that had blown in through the door. Claire quickly rounded them up and tossed them back outside, and as she looked out over the yard, she noticed the boy in the Michael Myers mask standing amongst the trees that were backed up to the fence. "Hey, what the hell are you doing back there?" she yelled. There was no response. "Mark, you better get over here." Her husband grunted as he stood from the couch and lumbered in her direction, and using the doorframe for support, he leaned over and stuck his head outside. "I'll tell you one thing, that isn't the Johnsons' boy. Robert is a couple of inches shorter than that and a few pounds heavier." Claire blew air from her nostrils and pinched the bridge of her nose in frustration. "At this point, I don't care who the hell he is. I just want him out of here. And if that means calling neighborhood security, then so be it." Mark stepped outside with his bare feet smacking on the flagstone patio. He stood right at the edge where it met the grass, and his shadow loomed over the yard as he blocked some of the light coming from inside the house. "Either you leave or we're calling security. You got that?" The boy stood motionless and refused to answer. "Are you deaf or something? Get out of here!" This time the boy moved by resting the orange candy bag he had down in the pine straw and opened it up. Reaching inside, the black handle of a kitchen knife emerged, the blade reflecting in the moonlight and bouncing back in their direction. "Holy shit!" Mark immediately threw his beer bottle at the child. It hurtled through the air before shattering in large chunks against his head, causing his small body to slump and fall to the ground with a soft thud. "Mark, what the hell is wrong with you?" Claire cried as she ran through the doorway. "You saw that? The kid had a damn knife." "He might have a concussion now too, thanks to you. Do you want to have assault charges brought to us by this kid's parents?" "I doubt they would do anything to us when they realized he was carrying a knife around. Just look at the size of that thing." Mark turned as he pointed in the boy's direction. However, to his shock, the child was gone. All that remained was the dark brown glass of his beer bottle scattered among the landscaping. "Where'd he go?" Mark asked as he stumbled backwards towards the house. Claire took a few steps back herself and fumbled for the phone in her pocket. "That's it, I'm calling the cops." Mark followed her back inside and locked the door behind them as the blue and white colours emitting from the television danced around the room. Claire dialed 911 and spoke with the dispatcher, and although difficult at times, she managed to keep the panic from seeping into her tone. "They'll have an officer here in about 6 minutes," she told Mark. Then her phone rang suddenly, causing her to jump, and looking down at the screen, she was met by the contact photo of her son, dressed up as Doctor Strange, that she had taken that very afternoon. "Tommy?" "Hey, Mum. I'm almost home. Is it okay if my friends come over in a few minutes and watch some movies? They had to go change because we all slipped in mud." At this point, her son's messy clothes were the least of her concerns. "That's fine, dear. Just please hurry home." "All right, see you soon," he said with delight as the call ended with a beep. Claire shoved the phone back in her pocket and looked at her husband. Mark was staring out the kitchen window with his nose pressed against the glass. "Any sign of the kid?" "Nothing yet," he said as he turned towards the backyard. "It's like he just disappeared into thin air." There was a knock at the door that caused both of them to jump, but Claire breathed a sigh of relief and quickly walked towards the door. She threw it open and greeted her son with a sigh of relief as the cool night air flooded inside. "I'm so glad you're home," she started to say, but was met with an empty doorstep, save for a few bugs that danced around the overhead light. Claire panicked and began frantically looking from side to side. "Tommy?" she called into the cool night air. Stepping forward, she was met with an unsettling crunch under her foot as she slowly looked down to find a piece of plastic cracked under her shoe. As she lifted her foot, she recognized it as the magical shield that had come with Tommy's costume. A knot formed in her stomach and she began to lose her balance. Propping herself against the doorframe, she called for her husband. Mark came barreling down the hallway in an instant. "Is he out here again?" Mark followed his wife's eyes down to the ground, and when he saw the pieces of shattered plastic resting on the concrete, the color drained from his face. "I'm getting my gun," Mark panicked. But before Claire could stop him, her husband had fled to their room to retrieve the firearm from the top shelf of their closet. As she watched him disappear around the corner, she heard a noise come from the driveway, and it sounded like something falling onto the pavement. She timidly approached the driveway and peered around the back of her car, and was met with nothing but the sight of an empty sidewalk. She creeped closer to the street and was surprised to feel her foot slip in something. She glanced down to find a small puddle of blood near the back tire of her SUV, and her shoe had smeared some of it across the driveway in a dark crimson streak. Tommy's cell phone lay on the concrete with the screen cracked, with Claire's contact still displayed. She screamed for her husband at the top of her lungs, and within a matter of seconds Mark came running through the front door with a pistol in his grasp. As he came closer to her, she pointed at the puddle illuminated under the sickly yellow glow of the streetlight, and Mark wrapped an arm tightly around his wife and pulled her away from it. However, he was met with resistance as she broke from his grasp and ran towards the street. As Claire glanced further down the sidewalk, she could see a trail of blood illuminated under the streetlights that dotted their way down the road. She felt her head spin and her knees begin to weaken, and she fell to the ground and began to sob. Mark rushed to her side and bent down to cradle her. "Tommy!" she screamed. She continued to scream her son's name into the cool night air, only to have it echo back as if the world was taunting her. As her cries carried up and down the street, hot tears ran down her cheeks, and Mark held her tighter as the two were bathed in the red and blue glow of an approaching police car. The vehicle pulled up to the curb, and the door was thrown open as the deputy caught sight of them. As he approached, Claire's voice continued to pierce the night, only to be lost in the howling wind. Long ago on Halloween night, a masked killer roamed the desolate streets of a quiet Arizona suburb. In search of victims, his blade trembled in his hand as he hunted. The muffled breathing behind the latex clown's mask was all that could be heard from him, and his eyes raced from side to side as he watched countless children prance around in their colorful or spooky costumes, shouting with joy and excitement from the endless amounts of sugar they would soon devour. Continuing down the street, he spotted a teenage couple preparing to enter a treehouse in a backyard. Making his way towards them, the couple was already safe inside. It wouldn't be long before they make their exit, and this man had nothing but patience along with the urge to strike. As the couple made love in the treehouse, the silent figure leaned behind the tree in wait. Taking the blade against the bark, he carved something that read, "Hide all you want, I will find you." As he finished his crude writing, a groan could be heard from above, implying that the mail had finished. "That was amazing. I'm going to grab a beer. You want one?" he asked his lover before she smiled and nodded in approval. Slipping into his jeans, he blew her a kiss as he exited through the trapdoor in the floor of the wooden asylum. Silently whistling a tune, the man behind the tree reached out and clamped his hand fiercely around the young teen's throat and slammed his head against the rough bark. The teen struggled to break free before the bark was struck a second time from his skull. Blood sprayed against the killer's mask as he forced the boy to stop breathing and ended his life through a final slam. The limp figure fell free from the grip and collapsed into the grass, and glaring down at the young boy, he felt no remorse for what he'd done. A thump from above refocused his attention to the girl still inside, and he took hold of the crude planks nailed into the tree, used as a ladder, and made his way up. "Well, it took you long enough," she began to say as the creaking of the trapdoor echoed inside the small room. "Where's my—" She stopped suddenly as she turned over to see who was standing over her. She began to sob in fear as he exposed the blade. "I swear, I have no idea where she is," she began. "You have to believe me. Please, don't hurt me." Her cries of desperation had no effect on the killer as he made his way closer to her. She pushed herself away from him until she was in the far corner of the treehouse, and inching closer, the man sheathed the blade and reached down to help her up, as if sympathizing with her. Her tears began to slow as she looked him in the eyes, believing that he would not harm her, and she smiled slightly, before the man let out a muffled exhale of breath and forcibly grabbed her throat. The rubber of the gloves was all she could feel before he pushed her against the wall and raised her higher. Exposing the blade once more, she struggled like her boyfriend had done outside as he lightly pressed the razor-sharp tip against her soft flesh. Without any motion of the blades, her struggles created incisions against her belly. The thick crimson poured onto the floor as she slowly began to go numb. Growing wary, the man decided to end her life. He carried her to the window with his hands still clamped around her throat and tossed her out. As she fell, she felt like an angel slowly falling from heaven, about to collide with the earth. The man glanced down as her lifeless body crashed beside her lover, their hands now together a final time. He sat in the window and leaped down with much fury. The man stumbled off into the night in silence as children continued to roam the streets in hopes of collecting the most candy. This is not the end of this man's gruesome tale. His rampage will not stop. He will continue on until he finds her and fatally ends her life.
I've never brought this story up, not even to my pals who were there that night, as I'm pretty sure they'd rather forget about it. But I can't help but think about it every year when Halloween approaches. We grew up in a simple, small town in a time when kids could run free without worry. Nothing mattered except getting home by the time the streetlights had turned on. The parks and the woods were our kingdom that we ruled fearlessly. That Halloween night, though, changed everything. A heavy mist filled the air, and it was like walking through a cloud, and I remember feeling the water droplets against my face, cold and damp, yet exciting. My pals had gotten permission to stay out later, unsupervised that night, as it was Halloween, as long as we promised to stick together. We had already trick-or-treated every house on our block and decided to continue down to the lower block for more candy. There's a park just outside that neighborhood where we rarely played, where it has a swing set with 2 cast iron sculptures on the top bar. One is a lion's head and the other is the head of a clown. They're about the size of a jack-o'-lantern and are similarly hollow. Weather and time had peeled away most of the paint, making them creepy even in the light of day. But I'm sure they looked much better when it was built in the 60s. Sometimes we'd dare each other to climb up to the top and reach into the mouth of either the clown or the lion to put something in it, or to see what someone had left. Those hollow heads with gaping mouths were not the only reason we rarely played in the park, but what took us there that Halloween night, a dare to reach into the clown's mouth. I remember standing shoulder to shoulder with my pals on the sidewalk in front of the park. The last house light on the edge of the lower block was barely visible up the road. The clown and lion looking down at us with open mouths and peeling paint was more than creepy. As if the ornaments on top of the swing set wasn't bad enough, it was the slide behind it that caused concern for every generation of kids who played there. A green S-curved slide stood behind the swing set, and we all knew the story behind that. Suddenly, something began to rustle from under the slide, and we all froze in panic as the unmistakable sound of a choked gurgle. I hope my heart never beats that hard again. Then something dark reached out and thrashed against it, metal hitting metal with a tink, tink, and the gurgling growing more into a wailing moan. I dropped my bag of candy and ran towards home as fast as I could, with my pals doing the same. I'm not sure if anyone else looked back, but I saw her, the dark form scampering out from beneath the slide. It staggered forward, grasping at its neck, and fell. Then it crawled and reached out at us. That gurgling cry will haunt me forever. Years before our time there, a girl had been playing alone at the park when she had put on her dog's collar and leash to play pretend that she was a dog. No one's really sure how it happened, but it seemed that she had climbed to the top of the slide and fallen off with the leash wrapping around the railing at the top, trapping her. She was found there, hanging, deceased. The tales about her ghost under the slide had been passed along from generation to generation of kids who played in that park. And I wonder how many stories about that slide have never been told. I've never brought it up myself until now. I just wish I could forget about it, you know?
It was Halloween night in 2020, and Mason Cummings' parents were nowhere to be seen. No, they weren't missing, nor were they dead or injured. In fact, they were perfectly healthy, at least for now. Mason's parents, Karen and Stuart, were wealthy enough to afford several vacations a year, and in the latter part of the year, they resolved to take several back-to-back to make up for the ones COVID lockdown mandates had stolen from them during the spring and summer. So as a result, they left their mansion of a home in the care of their 20-year-old son until they returned on November the 1st. Make sure, Mason's mother told him as his father jammed their 10th stuffed suitcase into their newest car, that you don't let any trash anywhere near the house. Mason smirked. His mum thought nearly everyone was trash, including him and Dad on some days. Keep an eye out for anyone looking up to no good. You know, sagging their pants or wearing some cheap, ugly costume on Halloween. Not some gross trick-or-treater kid either. I don't want a speck of dirt on even the doormat between now and the time we get home. Got it? Got it, Mason said cheerfully. And Mum walked down the driveway in her heels, briefly raising a hand in farewell as Mr. Cummings laid down on the horn for her to hurry so they'd make their flight. Mrs. Cummings didn't need to worry about the doormat, because it was nowhere to be found by 12 a.m. on Halloween night. Someone who'd left the party early had stolen it. The house was a hive of hedonistic anarchy, swarmed with half-dressed, half-conscious college kids, and completely littered with trash. Early on, the festivities were loud enough to arouse the ire of everyone in the neighborhood. The partiers already had earned one warning from the police, so after a while, and as they were finally becoming tired, they calmed things down. Most of the guests had left. Now it was just Mason, Aaron, and Emily. Aaron was the lovable oddball from Mason's group, always up to weird and dumb antics, but still outgoing and obnoxious, even to fit comfortably into Mason's clique. He'd come dressed in a dollar store Deadpool outfit that was 2 sizes too small. He was the only one who wore a costume, not because he'd missed any memo that it wasn't a costume party, but simply because he'd felt like it. Indeed, no one had worn any sort of mask at the party, scary or otherwise. Emily was Aaron's girlfriend, known for being short and fast-talking, and for flawlessly performing Ellie Woods in their high school's production of Legally Blonde. Not because of any acting talent, but because her personality was essentially the character. Look, I just don't believe in outer space, you guys. Like, how can it be a real thing? We can't leave the mantle of the Earth. It just isn't possible. Am I wrong? I can't be wrong about this, you guys. Like, you don't even know how many times I've fought with my friends over this. It was an old friendly debate the 3 friends had had before. Aaron was laughing hysterically, still drunk. His hair was a mess. He'd finally taken off his Deadpool mask, and Mason was just shaking his head, flashing a pearly smile. None of them gave a crap if outer space was real or not. Mason thought it was, but what did outer space matter to him? Outer space, real or not, hadn't crushed his party, and neither had anything else, including COVID, whose existence mattered even less to him than the existence of space, or whatever was out there floating through it. Aaron slowly looked around the room, taking in the sight of the trashed house. In the kitchen, the glass of one of the microwaves was broken, and blood-soaked from someone's hand. In front of them lay an overturned bookshelf. Every family portrait hanging on the wall in the hallway had been torn down, and the face of the clock hanging over the fireplace was cracked. And that was only downstairs. Dang, he chuckled. Your parents are going to be so pissed. Mason scoffed. They'll get over it. They can replace all their stuff. I don't know, man, Aaron said skeptically, still laughing. This is pretty bad. Yeah, Emily agreed, nodding rapidly and laughing herself. This was probably the biggest party you've ever thrown. It's a big house, said Mason with a shrug. Not everything's broken, and they'll get over what is. It's not a big deal. This is a big house, Aaron said slowly, as if he were just now noticing it. He gazed around again as if in awe. I bet someone could be passed out in one of the bathrooms and we wouldn't find them until morning. He laughed uproariously, and his girlfriend pushed him playfully, again joining his laughter. Mason smiled and rolled his eyes. Y'all are morons, he remarked affectionately. Emily and Aaron continued to laugh. It seemed they could go on all night. But then something interrupted them. The chime of the doorbell. Mason glanced up at the clock. When he remembered it was busted, annoyed, he took out his phone. It's 3 a.m. Who the hell could that be? Trick-or-treaters? Aaron guessed sarcastically. Emily giggled and pushed him again. Shut the hell up, Mason mumbled, although he privately worried some adult, late-night trick-or-treaters had indeed turned up, the kind of trash his mum had warned him to look out for. After a moment of trepidation, he walked to the front door and creaked it open. He wasn't so sure who it'd be, guessing now that it might be the cops again. But it wasn't. It was indeed a trick-or-treater. A kid under a sheet with holes cut into it for his eyes, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Whoa, Mason said, taken aback. He blinked several times as if to make sure he was seeing correctly. Kid, where are your parents? He stuck his head out of the door, looking around to see if anyone was accompanying the trick-or-treater, but the street was totally empty. The kid didn't answer. He didn't say anything. Instead, he silently extended his arm and presented his pumpkin-shaped candy bucket. Only one piece of candy was inside. Mason looked down and squinted at it. It was large for a piece of candy and wasn't a brand he recognized. It seemed to be dark red in color, and for one terrible moment, he thought he saw it move and believed it might be a tarantula. He jumped a little. The kid rattled his candy buck insistently, as if imploring Mason to take whatever was inside. He briefly turned his head to look at his friends for help, but they only stared back at him and at the kid, fascinated and a little scared. "What's he got, man?" Aaron asked. "Don't know," Mason replied. He turned back to their visitor. "What's that, kid? Some kind of Halloween decoration?" The kid, still silent, leaned forward. His eyes grew large, and for the first time Mason noticed how unusual they looked. Bloodshot, with seemingly bright red irises and violet pupils. The dark circles under the kid's eyes seemed to suggest he hadn't slept in days. Maybe he'd been out all night lost. The kid also apparently hadn't seen the sun in quite some time, judging by the strange paleness of his skin, just visible through the holes in the sheet. Mason looked at the kid for a moment before slowly reaching into the bucket and picking up the object, some sort of spiked ball. Whatever it was made of some strange, prickly material, as if he was holding a ball of static. Mason's instincts told him to drop whatever this strange orb was, but he clutched it, fascinated. He wasn't able to guess what it was. He'd never touched anything like it before. Its strange spikes, which Mason had initially taken to be spider legs, seemed to be pricking his palm, but it wasn't painful. They made a strange noise like the quick rustling of many needles. There was no mistaking it, though. The thing, indeed, was moving. Suddenly it gave a small but piercing screech, and Mason shouted in alarm and dropped it. As soon as it hit the floor, he kicked it into the night. "Kid," he spat. "What the hell do you think you're—" But when he looked up, the kid was gone. Mason blinked, stunned, and peered out of the door, looking down the street both ways, but could see nothing but street lamps and houses in the still quiet of the night. "Where'd he go?" Aaron was laughing. "Didn't give him his treat, so he gave you a trick." "Shut up," Mason groaned, and he began walking back to his seat in the living room, but stumbled. The chills of sickness had suddenly flown up through his body. "Ugh," he groaned, shivering as he eased back into his chair. He tried to say something, but was interrupted by a fit of coughing. "Dude, you don't look so hot," Aaron said, genuinely concerned. Mason's coughing continued, now worsening into hacking. Some mucus flew onto the floor. His nose leaked a thin and runny snot. "Ew," Emily cried, jumping away. "What the hell, Mason?" But Mason couldn't respond. His head was swimming. It felt ready to crack in two. "Dude, you're white as a sheet." And he was. Mason began to sweat. His skin took on a ghostly pallor. He grabbed his chest suddenly, and breathing seemed hard. Still possible, but hard. Harder than it had ever been for him. Still, he seemed finally able to talk. I, he said with some difficulty. He paused to cough. "I might need to lie down." "Do you think it's COVID?" asked Emily. That kid looked kinda sick. He couldn't give it to him that quickly, Aaron pointed out. But he had to admit himself it wasn't the stupidest thing Emily had ever said. Not by a long shot. "Still, you might have it, bro. It can take a few days to come on." Mason nodded. His breathing was labored, but he wasn't yet worried. He was still able to get air. It wasn't easy, but he was definitely able to get air in. That was good. Yeah, that was good. "Dude, do you want to go to the hospital?" "No," cried Mason, throwing more mucus onto the floor. He coughed violently. No, I hate hospitals. Really, I'm fine, guys. You don't look fine, Emily remarked. Her face suddenly turned worried. Her mind began to race. Maybe we should leave, she said, turning to her boyfriend. Leave? Mason said incredulously. What? Are you afraid I'm going to give you COVID? His friend said nothing for a moment. Well, you probably have it, Aaron finally said with some trepidation. We might already have it too since we've been around you all night. You might have given it to everyone at the party. We should probably tell them. Yeah, Emily agreed, nodding. Yeah, and then there's that kid. You might have given it to him too. Yeah, Aaron said, and we don't know what that kid was doing out so late without his parents. We should call the cops or someone to find him. He could be out there lost. Mason shook his head and waved a disapproving hand as he tried to catch his breath. The kid didn't say he was lost, did he? Someone was probably with him. Like who? Emily asked. Who takes their kid out trick-or-treating at 3 a.m? Mason glared at her. Yeah, Aaron reasoned. If that kid was with someone, it wasn't his parents. Like, maybe he got kidnapped. Maybe the kidnapper sent him to the door to give you that weird thing in his candy bucket. Yeah, Emily gasped, realizing something. Yeah, Mason. People do some messed up stuff. Someone might have been using that kid to poison you. You don't know what that thing was. Maybe it's not COVID. Maybe that kid put poison in you. Mason eyed her quizzically. She hadn't made this much sense in all the time he knew her. She looked terrified. Aaron too. He was just about to relent and allow them to take him to the hospital. But then out of nowhere, a giant, bone-chilling moan, like that from some tortured phantom, sounded loudly from upstairs. Emily let out a little yelp. Aaron paled, looking nearly as white as Mason, and everybody froze. Mason was too scared to even cough, though he felt the urge. What the hell was that? Aaron whispered. Mason thought for a moment, suppressing a cough. He answered reasonably. Someone from the party. You said it yourself. We might have forgotten someone in the bathrooms upstairs. That didn't sound like someone drunk to me, Emily said fearfully. Mason covered his mouth to cough. Well, he said, almost annoyed. It couldn't be anything else. Emily had to summon all her strength not to cry. She turned to her boyfriend. Aaron, she said in a small voice. Maybe you should go check. Aaron gulped, hesitated, then reluctantly he nodded, and without a word slowly ascended the stairs at the far end of the room. Emily clasped her hands together, watching Aaron fearfully until he disappeared upstairs. Suddenly, Mason erupted with his worst fit of coughing yet. He stood, bending over and holding his stomach. Emily turned and was horrified to see Mason retch violently and vomit up what seemed like a bloody wad of tissue. She cried in horror and Mason trembled, staring at what he could only register as some organ he'd coughed up. His lung, his stomach, something that no one should ever see and only ever saw if they were certain to die. Some part of himself that he knew must be there inside him, but that didn't seem real until now, when it was staring him in the face, plopped lamely onto the once immaculate white carpet in a chunky pool of blood and mucus. Before anyone could say anything, the upstairs erupted with Aaron's screams. Suddenly, Emily and Mason were caught in what seemed like a terrible windstorm swirling throughout the entire house. More furniture crashed, the dressers upstairs, the kitchen cabinets, and the lights flickered and buzzed. Emily was tearing her throat screaming, and the whole house seemed to quake. From upstairs, Aaron's screams continued even louder amid the bedlam, though they were now desperate and muffled and choked. Something snaked its way from downstairs, and Mason's eyes bulged as he looked up to see what was clearly a pure white bedsheet floating down the stairs without anyone in it, at least not anyone human. He thought he could detect the eyes of the kid, those strange, sickly red-purple eyes, suspended like sinister alien planets in the eye holes of that sheet. Then he heard the fast, scuttling, needly sound of the kid's strange spiky ball, so loud it was overtaking Emily's screams. It grew louder and louder, devolving into a loud and terrible buzzing, sounding now like a swarm of angry killer wasps. The sheet spread out wide when it finally came to the bottom of the stairs. Aaron's screams faded away, as did Emily's, and the sheet seemed to be covering all like a blanket, the eye holes fixed squarely on Mason, and it was gliding toward him slowly like a sinister and hungry stingray. Mason searched around. He could barely make anything out in the house. Everything seemed dark and blurry, and time seemed slow. The lights continued to flash, now at slow and random intervals, and Emily had vanished. The only thing he could see clearly now was the sheet, expanding, somehow reaching every inch of the room. The front of it lifted up slightly as it came closer, and Mason could see underneath it. It was a being propelled forward by those piercing, scuttling spikes that were now protruding out of the eye holes. Mason Cummings stood on weak legs, ready to collapse. His terror seemed to leave him, and seemed resigned to his fate. Through the days of his blistering fever, he accepted, finally, that he'd played with fire, and now he was going to pay for it. The sheet rose, the virus revealed itself, its round face seeming now to split open into a gaping mouth. The spikes seemed to become a set of sharp and terrible teeth. The virus let out a loud, hungry screech, and then, in an instant, Mason was swallowed whole and the sheet collapsed all over. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Cummings arrived home to a suspiciously quiet house. Opening the door, they faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. Seeing first her son's pale, lifeless face out of everything and his blood-stained mouth, Mrs. Cummings screamed until she fainted. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.